those women were the first women from their country to ski to the South Pole when we reached there, and 2 of them were the first person from their country to ski to the South Pole.
You're listening to the Adventure Sports Podcast, brought to you by 180 Tech. We talk with adventurers from around the globe to bring you the inspiration and motivation you need to get started in the outdoors or to keep you moving if you're already there.
Hello friends, Kurt here. Today I have Felicity Aston with me, and Felicity has quite the amazing resume for polar exploration. Back in 2000 to 2003, she was the senior meteorologist in Antarctica, and that introduced her to what the Arctic and Antarctic living was like. In 2005, she did the race across Arctic Canada called the Polar Challenge. In 2006, she crossed the Greenland ice sheet. In 2012, she became the first person to ski across Antarctica, and I'm excited to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. And more recently, she made it to the North Pole just this last April. In addition to that, she has crossed Lake Baikal. She has completed the Marathon des Sables. Wow, what a list of achievements. Welcome to the program, Felicity.
Thanks very much.
You bet. I'm just blown away by all of these major expeditions, and I'm going to start just right there. So, Felicity, how is it possible for one person to have done so many major expeditions?
I've always been in a bit of a hurry, hungry for new experiences, I guess. And so, when you finish one big expedition, it's taken up so much of your life and absorbed so much of your time and attention and energy that, once it's done, I guess you're looking for something else to fill that hole. And, and so it's very easy to sort of skip from one to the other, and, and great fun along the way.
And you spend so much time in the Arctic or the Antarctic. Why? What is the appeal that draws you back to those icy landscapes?
Yeah, it's funny because, I've spent time in the jungle in South America, and I've spent time in deserts, but there is something about the winter environment that I find endlessly fascinating. And I guess now at this stage, it's the place where I feel most comfortable. And so perhaps that's an element as to why I keep being drawn back. But Antarctica particularly is just such a unique place to experience. And you do experience it. Nobody goes to the Antarctic and comes back going, oh, yeah, that was all right. They come back raving about what an impact it's had on them as people. There's very few places, I think, that can do that.
Wow. So this started for you back in 2000 when you were in Antarctica as a senior meteorologist. What was that initial impact like? Let's start there. This is what, I guess, convinced you that you loved the Arctics. So what was that like?
Yeah, I was very young. I was 23. It was my first proper job after university. So it was daunting for all those reasons. But I remember when I first turned up at the base that was to be my place of work and my home for the next 2.5 years, I remember looking at it thinking, oh my goodness. It was really daunting because you had the backdrop of the Antarctic Peninsula behind it. It was a really busy place. It was the middle of a short summer season, which is frantically busy with everyone trying to get everything done before winter comes in. And just thinking about all the time that was to come where I would be cut off from my family, my friends. In the wintertime for 7 months, you're pretty much cut off from the rest of the world. There are no boats, no planes, nothing like that. But I think the thing that really worried me was, will I be good enough? Will I be able to pull my weight, or will some terrible flaw and weakness be shown up in me, and I'll be shown not to be good enough, not to be able to do this. And so I think that was the most worrying thing of all. But in terms of it going on to then lead me to go back to do expeditions, I think I got, because my job was so great at enabling me to travel to different parts of Antarctica. I'd had a glimpse out of plane windows and at various forward field camps of this, stunning scenery. And I was so curious to find out what it would be like to travel across it, on skis, on foot, on surface level, to travel over land in this amazing place. And that's what I think motivated me to go back as an expedition.
Well, it is amazing to think that we have an entire continent at the bottom of this planet that is almost entirely uninhabited. And when it is inhabited, it's a scientific team like yours that really is sustained from elsewhere. There's no way in Antarctica to just stay and be and have any sort of a long-term relation with land without that outside support. So it amazes me to think about the vastness of a whole continent on this planet that very few people know anything about.
Yeah, I mean, we're very used to seeing Antarctica as a sort of hazy white blob at the bottom of the world map, but, it's twice the size of Australia. And we think of Australia as being a pretty big continent. And this is twice the size. And as you say, it's completely empty. There's never been any native population. So unlike the Arctic, there isn't any sort of human culture in this place. It's completely devoid of any kind of human history, up until, the heroic age of exploration, up until the early 1900s. And there is no life once you get away from the coast. There's no land mammals. There's no polar bears. There's no penguins or seabirds or, there's nothing once you get into the interior. And that emptiness of everything, I think, is why it is such a unique part of our planet. There is nowhere else where you experience quite that level of solitude. And it is that vastness and that emptiness that is part of its appeal.
So how cold is cold in the wintertime there?
I think the lowest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica was something like minus 98 degrees centigrade. I mean, that's like 5 times colder than my freezer at home. It's, a ridiculous temperature. And I think it's bordering on what people can actually survive, what it's possible to survive. But if you went to Antarctica in an average winter time at the coast, it'd probably get down to sort of minus 40, something like that. And then if you're at the South Pole, I think it's pretty common that they get down to sort of below minus 60, things like that.
Wow. Very, very cold.
Yeah, I mean, the coldest I've ever experienced, because I've only been in Antarctica on skis in the summertime, because otherwise it's just too dark, too cold to be on a ski journey. And the coldest I've ever experienced has been down to sort of minus 50, that kind of thing. But a few years ago, I made an expedition to a part of Siberia where there's this tiny little village called Omyakon of about 300 people. And they held the wonderful title of the coldest inhabited place on Earth. So they once recorded a temperature of minus 71.2 degrees centigrade. Wow. And the amazing thing about that is that, as you say, in Antarctica, you have to be supported by the outside world. You have, specialized equipment, specialized skills, knowledge, you've been trained and you have plans A through to Z of what ifs. But, in this tiny little part of Siberia, people are going to work, driving cars, the kids go to school, all at temperatures far colder than those in the greater part of Antarctica. So it was a bit of a mind-boggling experience to go there and see how they cope with that.
Well, of all of your various expeditions and all the different things that you've done, do any stand out as particularly amazing to you, life-impacting?
Wow. I think every expedition leaves me changed in some way. And I think that's because the expeditions that I put together, when I'm thinking about, okay, what am I doing next? They have to be challenging to me in some way or different, something I haven't done before. I'm one of those people that get bored quite easily. So, if it's something I know I can do, it's probably not going to hold my attention for very long. And these expeditions, they take a year, 2 years to put together. So you really have to be sure that it's something that's going to get you fired up and keep your enthusiasm going for a very long time. Yeah. And in terms of a standout moment, it's really difficult to pick just one. And so often, I get asked about what's the best moment and what's the worst moment of a trip. And so often they are one and the same thing. I remember the moment when the plane first left me when I was going to ski across Antarctica alone. And I just remember standing there on the coast of Antarctica, watching this plane become a tiny little black blob in the sky and then disappearing. And I knew that it had taken a whole week of logistical maneuvering for that plane to be able to drop me off in that spot. So therefore, no one was going to come back for me in a hurry without it being very timely, time expensive as well as money expensive to do that. And I knew there was not another living human being for about 600 kilometers in any direction. That sudden shock of isolation, of being so totally responsible for my own well-being, and so cut off from other real forms of human contact, human support. That was at the same time terrifying and wonderful. And in terms of experiences that have changed me as a person, that experience there of trying to get my own emotions under control, of trying to work through that fear that I was left with because of that sense of aloneness, that has to be up there with with the best of them.
Oh, yeah. Let's dive into that emotional bit just a little. I want to go back and touch on more of the different expeditions and then come back to Antarctica and spend more time on that. But the reason I bring this up is we climbed a 14er last weekend. And it was a class 3, and there was some exposure, and it was difficult. And there are a lot of people attracted to this mountain who hadn't climbed many mountains. And I preface it that way just because it kind of explains what was going on. Some people were climbing and scaling the mountain with confidence. Other people were so full of adrenaline that they were jumpy. I mean, they were jumping around like fleas, you know what I mean? And when they would start to climb, they would just kind of haphazardly grab and scurry, and you could tell that they were just on adrenaline overload. Then there were other people who actually sat down, put their hands over their face, and sobbed and cried because the experience was so overwhelming for those people. And it's nothing like being dropped off, isolated, alone in Antarctica. But because you had that experience, part of the reason that people like to do adventure sports is to stretch themselves. It's to learn more about themselves and find out what they're capable of doing. And I saw a lot of people having that experience on the mountain. But I guess the question I have for you is, how did you learn to manage your emotions so that you could actually be dropped off solo in Antarctica and say, you know what, I'm going to be all right?
Well, it is interesting. And this whole area of psychology is a massive topic that, I don't think we could ever be done with discussing. And it's interesting for me how, although my experiences are very niche, when you start talking about the psychology of it, so many people find resonance with their own life, even though, their own life experiences are so different to mine. And yet there seems to be this sort of common thread that runs through so many different experiences that people have. But, the idea that I ever sort of conquered that fear, I think is probably misleading. I found ways to keep going despite that fear, but I don't think it ever went away. It was just that in every moment I felt that fear to a greater or lesser extent. I found routine very helpful. There's a polar explorer called Erling Kagg. He was the first person to ski to the South Pole. And in his wonderfully titled book called Philosophy for Polar Explorers, although it's not just for polar explorers, it's for everybody. But he said this thing, let routine take command of feeling. And, this quote kept going round and round in my head, let routine take command of feeling. So my life on expeditions is quite ruled by routine anyway. I have routines for everything, putting my tent up, putting my tent down, what I do in the mornings, what I do in the evenings before I go to sleep, because it's easier that way to make sure that you're not forgetting anything and that everything is getting done. If you've got a routine, you don't even have to worry about whether everything's done or not. But this idea of sticking to that routine even more religiously so that you take the emotion out of what you're doing really worked for me. And I think this is, if you've ever sort of got up early to go for a run before work, and it's, a cold, miserable, rainy morning, it's still pretty dark out there. If you sat by your door before you go, lacing up your shoes, thinking about what is it going to feel like out there? How am I going to feel as I'm running through that rain? What is that going to feel like? Then you would never go out and do that run. But if you sort of just let your body almost mechanically take over, and it's like you put your shoes on, you grab your water bottle or your a squeezy bag or whatever it is that you take with you, and off you go out the door. If you let that routine kind of carry you forward, it takes the emotion out of it. You're not thinking about how you're going to feel. You're just going through the motions until you're already outside the door and pounding the pavement. And, it's exactly the same thing in Antarctica for me, is that I almost became quite robotic. Everything was done by routine. And it just helped to take the emotion out of it, helped to take, the edge off of my personal emotional reactions to the circumstances I found myself in.
I think that's probably one of the reasons why you're so successful at all of these ventures, because you have to be able to take care of what has to be taken care of just to survive. And so if you allowed fear or concern or things like that to inhibit that process, you could really endanger yourself.
Yeah. And, I don't want to give the impression that I was always, admirably calm. I mean, there were times when I would sit on my sledge and put my head in my hands and sob my heart out and think, what have I done? But I was always able to bring myself back to that idea of routine. I remember about 10 days before I finished, so the journey took me about 59 days. About 10 days before I finished that journey alone across Antarctica, I had I guess you would call it a panic attack. I was sitting there. I knew the weather was really bad outside. The visibility was really bad. And, when I say bad visibility in Antarctica, what I mean is that you can't see anything. You can't see up from down. You're totally disoriented. You feel nauseous, almost like a travel nausea, because, there is no up or down. There's no fixed point of reality. And I knew I was quite near some crevassing, and I knew there was no hope that I would ever see any kind of crevassing until I was on top of it. And the whole thing just, the whole situation got on top of me. And I had, I was absolutely petrified, absolutely terrified of getting out of that tent. And so I thought, okay, I sat there and I thought it through. And I thought, what I've done here is that 10 days away from the finish, my mind was already at the finish. My head, I was already done. And yet it was like my body, the reality was struggling to keep up. So I thought, right, what I need to do now is reset. I need to just spend a couple of hours, not getting out the tent straight away and skiing, but a couple of hours sorting myself out, both physically and mentally, as if I was about to set out on a 10-day expedition. And so that's what I did. I kind of repacked my sledges and I sorted out all my ration bags and everything as if I was setting out on a brand new 10-day expedition. And, those kind of mind tricks you play with yourself, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But that one worked particularly well for me. And in that instance, that was how I managed to carry on despite this, rather high level of fear.
By now, you certainly know who Bent Gate is. That's for a great reason. Bent Gate Mountaineering has been sponsoring the Adventure Sports Podcast almost from the beginning, and we really appreciate that. They've made it possible for all the great shows to continue coming your way. We want to say thanks by reminding you to go to them for your backcountry gear. If you live in Colorado, then just stop by their store in Golden. If not, go to bentgate.com. They have what you need, from the latest ultralight gear to the tried and true classics for climbing, hiking, and camping, like Arc'teryx, Hilleberg, Nemo, Western Mountaineering, and many more. Need advice? They have you covered there too. Their staff are passionate adventurers who can offer help from their own experiences. Bentgate also hosts lots of events and speakers. Check out their website to see the schedule and to see all of their products. Help take care of the Adventure Sports Podcast by getting your gear from Bentgate Mountaineering. On your first, I'm going to say night, and that might not even be correct. I don't know exactly what the season was and how much light and darkness that you had, but the first stop of the first day, how did you feel as you were setting up your tent and getting ready to rest?
Yeah, the first, you don't have any darkness. It's summertime in Antarctica when you're traveling, so it's 24-hour daylight. But for me, being in the tent was when my aloneness was most apparent, and when I had to be really careful about letting that emotion in, because when you're on the move, when you're on your skis, it's very easy to pretend that there's a team behind you. If you turned around, there'd be a team there behind you, and it was easy to trick myself into thinking I wasn't alone. And there was lots of distraction. Antarctica itself is a wonderful distraction. You see the weather come and go. You see wonderful optical effects. There's a lot to take your mind off things. But as soon as you get into the tent, there's no escaping the fact that you are alone and by yourself. And of course, as you'll know yourself, the environment sounds a lot more terrifying when you're inside a tent than it does when you're outside a tent. So when you're sat in a little tent being buffeted by an Antarctic storm, and you're acutely aware of just how alone you are and just how far help is. Yeah, that was perhaps the time I struggled most.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be the toughest, for sure. So how cold did it get on your expedition, on the crossing of the continent?
Well, my sledges, I had two sledges attached one behind the other. And even though I was going to have a resupply at the South Pole and another resupply about 500 kilometers further along my route, both of which were dropped off by aircraft, even though I was having those two resupplies, when I put everything in my sledge, it weighed far too much. So I went through those sledges again and again and again, throwing out anything that wasn't going to be absolutely essential to success or failure, that wasn't going to make that level of difference. And so one of the things that got the boot was a thermometer, because I don't actually need to know what the temperature is. So the thermometer got the boot, and I got my sledges down to about 85 kilograms, which is kind of, I think, about an average weight for a fully grown man, that kind of weight.
Right.
So that was kind of manageable. So I don't know what the temperature was, but, I've spent 2 winters in Antarctica before. And when I got to the South Pole, I was told that it was minus 38. And that felt pretty balmy compared to what I'd just come through. So part of my journey to get to the South Pole had gone way over 4,000 meters, which, it starts to affect temperature. So I think I was down in the minus 40 somewhere for most of that, for that first leg from the coast to the pole. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That is very, very cold. So what kind of sleeping bag did you have to use to be able to stay warm while you rested?
Yeah, I had a down 5-season bag that I looked after meticulously because sleep was very important. When you're doing a long trip like that, making sure you've got time to recover every day is, what ensures that you can keep going for that longer period of time. So sleep was really important to me, and making sure I got good sleep as well. And you're not going to get good sleep if you're cold. But I perhaps paid more attention to the mats I was using underneath. So I used these sort of special closed cell foam kind of mats, and then an insulator under that, so that the flooring in the tent was pretty good at keeping me insulated from the snow.
So tell us a story, if you would, about an experience where maybe you saw something or experienced something along the way that really stands out in your mind as really unique.
Gosh, there's so many unique things in Antarctica. One of my most incredible sights in Antarctica was actually when I was traveling with a team to the South Pole. I was traveling with an international team of women, and we were skiing from the coast to the South Pole. And I was leading the team, and I was navigating as much as you do. We'd seen lots of sort of parhelions and sundogs and things like that. But suddenly this kind of optical display spread out into having fake suns. So we could see 4 or 5 suns in the sky, and they were all joined together with this sort of halo effect. And then each of these suns had parhelions and, an extended display of rainbows and optical effects around it. And it was just one of the most stunning things I've ever seen. And also one of the weirdest things. And I remember even as I was watching it, thinking, how on earth am I going to explain this to other people? And how on earth are they going to believe me? Because it just seems so weird. And I remember Rena, who was from India, was behind me, and she was a very spiritual person. And she said something along the lines of, we've been given true blessings. And, although I didn't translate that experience in those spiritual terms, it really did feel like that. It felt like we'd been shown something pretty special.
It's something I've said on the show many times, Felicity, but I keep telling people, if you go out and do things then you have mind-blowing experiences. And you can't plan for those experiences. But one thing's for sure, if you stay home, it's not going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I mean, they say you never regret the things you do, you only regret the things you don't do. And, so many times on expeditions, what in the moment felt like the worst possible thing that could happen, in retrospect, turn into some of your most nostalgic memories. When you get together with those teammates, you don't necessarily talk about the nice sunny days when you had a wonderful time. You talk about, do you remember when we ran out of food and we started sucking the sugar coating off the painkiller pills in the first aid kit? Or do you remember when we, when our feet froze to our socks and, we invented some kind of thing to make it better? And these moments where you feel such pride and, you feel alive in the fact that you manage to find a way to make it work, and it's a euphoria. And it's the same, carrying on my analogy of going for a run in the rain. You come back and you feel a million times better after that run in the rain than you ever do after a run in the sunshine. There's something odd in human beings. We delight in misery in some way. The tougher it is, if you sort of go through real tough times and then come out the other end, there's a real sort of delight in that.
Oh, yeah. You have a format now. You've done some things that it provides you an opportunity to share things with the rest of the world that really matter to you. And you just mentioned that you were leading a group of women to the South Pole. And this is something I think that does matter to you. So tell us a little bit about your feelings about that. In 2018, what is the place of women?
Yeah, well, it's something that, I feel very passionately about. I feel very responsible, or I feel a responsibility about the fact that, right now in the same world in which I am alive, the majority of women, the reality is the majority of women alive on the planet today aren't free to make their own choices in life, be that through reasons of culture or politics or religion. They're not free to make their own choices. And as a woman, I feel that very personally. And I think that I have a responsibility as a woman to do whatever I can to try and make that situation better. And the one thing that I do well is put together expeditions. So I started putting together expeditions for women in the hope that it would send a really positive message about what women are capable of doing and should be free to do, should they wish to. And so the first one that I put together was an international women's team to the South Pole, where we had women from across the Commonwealth. So we had women from Singapore, India, Brunei, Dar es Salaam, Jamaica, Ghana and West Africa, all sorts of places, big mix of cultures. And many of those women were the first women from their country to ski to the South Pole when we reached there. And two of them were the first person from their country to ski to the South Pole. And that really worked very well in terms of sending a positive message, because then when they got back to their home countries, the fact that they were the first of their nation to ski to the South Pole gave them a platform from which to share their story. And the fact that it was a woman telling that story, was really powerful. And we received so many emails and communications from women and girls, but also from men who said, I realized after reading your story that I had made the assumption that my wife, my daughter, my sister wasn't capable of this or wasn't capable of that, or, that I hadn't been giving her the support that she needed, or, so it made men think differently too. And, I was very proud of that. So 10 years later, I put together another expedition, which was an international team of women to ski to the North Pole. But this time I focused on the Middle East. So we had 11 women skiing to the North Pole just this past April. And they were from countries like Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, as well as countries like Sweden, Slovenia, Russia, France, and the UK. And so it was part cultural experiment, part expedition, which is a bit unusual. And again, when we reached the North Pole, we had women there that were the first person from their country. So they're now going back to Qatar or Oman or wherever they came from, saying, I am the first person, I am the first Qatari to ski to the South Pole, and I just happen to be a woman. And so I hope that has the same positive effect as the previous expedition to the South Pole.
Do you know some stories that kind of show us the effect that these expeditions have had when these ladies return back to their home countries and people have to open their eyes and say, wow.
Yeah, and it happened immediately in this case when we were flying back from the North Pole. On board the helicopter that came to collect us from the North Pole was a journalist that had been sent out to cover our story. And as we were flying over the ice from the North Pole, he sat next to me and he said, Felicity, you've changed my opinion with this expedition. And I said, what do you mean? And he'd been sent out to cover the expedition story because he was an Arabist. He spoke fluent Arabic. He'd lived in the Gulf states a long time. And he said, when I was given this story to come and cover, he said, I thought, no way. There is no way women from Arabia would be able to do this. And he said, to be honest, I came out here to laugh at you. And he said, you have made me rethink my perspective. And I just thought that is really wonderful of you to say that, because it means that we know it's working. And what they say about, if you can just change one mind at a time, then slowly ripples turn into waves. And so that's what we hope.
I love that. And I applaud you for what you're doing. I find it so perplexing that in today's world, I mean, even in the West, there are still injustices when it comes to gender. But when you go other places, the separation is still vast. There are so many women that are still held back and oppressed and not allowed to reach out for their full potential. And that's just, frankly, it's disgusting that could still be going on. So I applaud you for highlighting this issue. For showing the world that it's wrong to think of one gender as incapable in some way. It's just ridiculous.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And, as you say, it does sort of start at home. And, I'm still moved to anger quite frequently when I hear people within my own expedition community talking about their expedition teams. And you still hear it quite frequently. They refer to having women on their team almost as if they're taking a hit in some way. Or they say something along the lines of, but she's really good at the psychological stuff. And that really annoys me, because I think, well, actually, she might actually be stronger than some of the other male members of your team. You have no idea. And, also conversely, I've worked with some women who have not been very good at the psychological stuff, that have frankly been complete battle axes to work with and haven't had the first clue. So I think the sooner we stop putting people in boxes due to their gender, their skin color, their religion, where they come from, the better. What we're all aiming for here, I think, is a world in which you judge people on their own merits and try not to make presumptions based on any other factors. And it's a hard thing to do, but that's what we've got to keep aiming for if we want to get this right.
Absolutely. Very good. Very well said, too. Hey, I think this would be fun. I would like to mention one of your expeditions, and then for you to give us just a brief reason why you decided to do this one, and maybe one of the key takeaways that came from it that you learned. And we can just go through the list, because I think it's worth highlighting all of these things. And I'm going to miss some of them, so you're going to have to fill in the gaps for me here.
Okay.
But let's start with the race across Arctic Canada, the Polar Challenge in 2005.
Yeah, well, that was my first experience of the Arctic. So I'd come straight from the British Antarctic Survey, and the method of travel there was very heavyweight. You take 2 radios, 2 tents, enough food for 2 men for 30 days. Even if you're just going out, for a couple of days, it was very heavyweight. It was very safety conscious. And so I decided to do the race because it taught me a whole new way of travel. It taught me about going lightweight and fast, about, the security of the race organization around you. So it was a mix of being supported and being independent. So it taught me a whole new style of travel. And it also taught me that you never travel in a team of 3. It's a terrible number to travel with, because however the discussion goes, it will always feel like 2 against 1. And that never turns out well. So I have never traveled in a team of 3 since then.
Really? So you prefer 2 or 4 or 5 or 6? It's just 3 is the bad number?
Any other number, I think, works out better. Even if you're traveling as a 2, then it's one-on-one and it's kind of fair and fine. But the 3 thing, it's very rare that you get each one in that 3 having a different viewpoint. Usually 2 people are more or less saying the same and one person is saying something different. And that's a very isolating position to be in. And it kind of emphasizes any sort of resting paranoia there might be. And it just is a difficult number to make work. So I've avoided teams of 3 ever since.
Well, that's a good word and a good point. Next one I have is 2006, and this is crossing the Greenland ice sheet.
Yeah, so this was my first independent expedition. So it wasn't part of an organized race or anything like that. It was just us going out onto the Greenland ice sheet. And it was the first time that I had been taken on the responsibility of leader in a full sense. So this expedition was my responsibility. I was leading it, and I felt the weight of that hugely. So I learned a lot through that. But, when I look back on that trip now, it takes my breath away just how stunningly naive we were. I mean, we got everything wrong. We've got rations wrong. We got our route even. I mean, we just found a map of Greenland and drew a straight line across the ice cap with a ruler, and that was our route. It was that stunningly naive. And so I think we were very lucky to get away with it. But also I'm extremely proud of that expedition, because the performance we put in is probably still to date my best expedition performance. We crossed the Greenland ice sheet in one direction in just 16 days. And then we came back in 14 days. So we did a double crossing and did the entire thing in 31 days total. So it was a pretty impressive performance to put in, but we really paid for it. We did it the hard way. But we learned a lot.
Goodness. So how many people were on that expedition? I'm sure it wasn't 3.
No, it wasn't. There were 4 of us, and it was a great team. We were all women again, and we just worked really well together as a team. We really sort of thought it out beforehand. Well, we thought we'd thought it out beforehand and made it work. But yeah, we got our boots wrong, so every day our feet were really frozen, and we got our rations wrong, so we were starving hungry. And yeah, we were lucky to get away with it, I think.
If you want to try backpacking but you don't really know where to start, I would suggest going to campcrate.net. They can help you find an itinerary and rent you the gear that you need. They'll ship it to your house or anywhere else in the U.S. You use the gear. When you're done, put it back in the box, put the included pre-printed return label on the outside, and ship it back. Camp Crate. Rent, explore, return.
I have to ask about the landscape of Greenland. I have seen Greenland from the air once, and it just enchanted me. I thought, wow, what is it like to be down there? What is Greenland like?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, actually, because I remember skiing across Greenland, looking up at the intercontinental jets flying over, thinking of all the people sat up there sipping their gin and tonics, getting a real pang of, oh my goodness, I would do anything to swap places with you right now. But yeah, the landscape of Greenland, I mean, it's just a thin fringe of rock and the rest of it is ice cap. So when we got to the edge of the ice cap, it was just a chaos of blocks of ice and just a really daunting thing to see as your first few steps onto the center of Greenland. The first few days were perhaps one of the biggest nightmares of the whole trip. And then the change that we saw. So we set out, I think it was at the beginning of May, and by the time we came back to where we'd started, it was unrecognizable because the amount of melt. The whole place had melted into these ridges, and in between the ridges were wide rivers of meltwater and terrifying moulins that we would come across, these big holes that form in the ice, and the water just roars into them. And you can just, by the sound of them, puts the hair on the back of your neck on edge. And if you fall in one of those things, no one's ever going to see you again. Just really terrifying. Yeah, terrifying stuff. So a wonderful landscape, but a really daunting one.
Okay, so I don't have dates for everything that you've done. The next one I have is 2012 when you crossed Antarctica, but I'll bet there's something going on between these two.
Yeah, so the International Women's Expedition to the South Pole was in 2009. And in between those, I ran the Marathon des Sables. So that was a whole different environment to get to grips with. And I think that did me a lot of good because I was able to experience again that sense of nervousness when you're not familiar with an environment. You know, you start obsessing over your kit and the smallest detail can suddenly seem like it has the greatest importance. And as someone who regularly takes people into my known environment, I regularly take people that have no previous experience into polar environments. I think it did me a lot of good to experience or remember what it's like to be going somewhere where you have no idea what to expect. So running through the Marathon des Sables was the reason I went there, was because it was a different environment. And I think the impact it had on me was remembering how terrifying it can be to go into an environment where you don't know what to expect. The International Women's Expedition, I mean, this was the biggest trip that I'd ever put together. It was 8 people. We were going to Antarctica, which is a really expensive place to go to. We needed to find corporate sponsorship in order to pay for it. So that took nearly 2 years of preparation to get all that together. I had to find the team. So finding women to go with me from places like Jamaica and Ghana and West Africa, you know, not the easiest thing to do. So I ended up traveling to a lot of different places to find these amazing women that came with me. And the experience that we had together, one of the things that really stuck out for me was just how formative those times you have in the tent can be. You know, when you go on an expedition with someone, you know them in a way that I'm not sure anyone else in their life knows them, because when you take someone into that environment, it doesn't matter where you come from, you know, everything that we like to hide behind is stripped away. You know, you don't know what car they drive or what their house looks like or what their job title is. You don't know anything. You're wearing the same clothes as them, you're eating the same food as them, you're doing the same things every day as them. And so what you get to see is the raw person that's left behind. You get to see who they truly are, and you see them when they're under pressure and when they're feeling vulnerable. So I think you get to know people very well, very quickly. And what has always kept me going is the fact that more often than not, what you see is amazing. You know, people surprise you for positive reasons far more often than they let you down. And, you know, just from tiny acts of kindness, which actually take on monumental proportions. You know, when you've only got 3 bite-sized bits of chocolate that day, you know, to notice that one of your teammates is having a tough day and to give them your chocolate, you know, just things like that, to give them a quiet hug, you know, when they need it, or to ask the right questions, and right up to, you know, really grandiose sort of decisions to step down when somebody needs to step down, even though you desperately want to be a part of it, or, you know, putting the group before your individual ambitions. You know, that's not an easy thing to do when this ambition has taken up 2 years of sacrifice, you know. So people do astound you and just remind you how amazing human beings can be and are. And I think, you know, in the rest of our lives, I think we could do with just remembering how brilliant people are more often. We hear a lot of negative stuff on the news and through the media about the rubbish people, about the people who are not so nice. I think we need to hear more about just how brilliant people are.
Well, it's amazing to think about the kinds of interpersonal interactions that would take place when you take 8 people, you know, on an expedition like this, and under very difficult conditions. I mean, we have to recall, we're talking about what you've done because you've done it successfully, and we say, oh yeah, you did this, great. But we have to remember that for, oh boy, scores and scores and scores and scores of years, when it became possible for humans to even get to Antarctica, people were trying to reach the South Pole and failing, trying to cross the continent and failing, and that there's a long history of attempts that did not go well. And yet here you are, and you've done it with people that have never even been to the Arctic before.
I think it's really easy to forget how lethal these places can be. You know, tragically, every now and again, there is a reminder. A few years ago, there was a a fatal air accident in Antarctica, because the planes are flying on visual rules. There's no air traffic control or radar posts or anything like that. So they're doing everything through sight, and cloud cover over white snow, it's very difficult. And even sort of ski expeditions, there was a fatality just a few years ago. And that one in particular, it was an explorer who was very highly regarded, very experienced, and it shook everybody, I think. Nobody's immune. And it's made us all perhaps think a little more about what we're doing. And, every time you go out to do an expedition, it's always a case of balancing up those risks, finding the level of risk that is acceptable to you. And then, you go back and you reevaluate that, to see whether you're still getting that balance right. I remember having a conversation with my mother about it once, because somebody had asked me after a talk, how does your mother feel about this? This must be, terrible for her every time you go off. And so I asked her about it, and she said, but I see how well you prepare and how carefully you prepare. And I see that, you're not going out there to take foolish risks. And I think there is perhaps a perception out there that to do these kind of polar journeys, you need to be an adrenaline junkie but in fact, it's the exact opposite. In order to make those risks acceptable, you need to sit down and, make plan after plan. You need to love a spreadsheet, that's for sure, to make sure that the risks you're taking, you're comfortable with.
Well, I'm sure that planning is one of the reasons why you've been successful. I don't think that you can do this without it. So.
No, and I think that goes for a lot of sports that are termed sort of extreme or adventurous. I think the reality is that there is a lot of sitting down and working stuff out. For sure, there's always characters in a pack that seem to fly by the seat of their pants and get away with it. But, not everybody's happy with that balance of risk. I think most people, particularly when you've got people relying on you to come back, you have to make sure that what you're doing is responsible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Give us your perspective. Having done such big things, I'd love to hear your perspective on the idea of just reaching for something bigger than yourself and then finding out that you're big enough to do it, perhaps. But, at some point with each of these expeditions, you have to question, should I be trying this or not? I guess that what I'm looking for is just your perspective on why it's worthwhile to reach beyond to something bigger than ourselves.
Gosh, that's a big question to end with. Wow. Yeah. So often I get asked the question, why? And I think the difficulty with asking someone like me that question is because, it's so self-evident to me. I want to go and do these things. I want to challenge myself. I want to feel as if I'm having an effect on something bigger than myself. I think if you don't feel that yourself, if you don't get that already, I find it hard to pinpoint the exact, to dissect that feeling and to pinpoint exactly why I feel that way. People ask, what did my parents do? Or, was I a tomboy when I was a kid? As if that's going to explain it. I think, if I had to sum it up in one word, the reason why I do these things is first and foremost curiosity, curiosity about the places themselves. Perhaps my biggest source of motivation for going to Antarctica is Antarctica. I want to see it. I want to know what it's like. And secondly, I also want to know what I would be like in those circumstances. When I first went to Antarctica at 23 with the British Antarctic Survey and was asking myself that question on the ship, looking at this tiny station, will I be good enough? Am I good enough? Am I going to let people down? I've been asking that question on every expedition since. The first time I was a leader with the team in Greenland, am I good enough? Is their confidence in me justified? And every time I go out, there's a version of that question. So I'm not sure if it's something innate in human nature to always wonder what's beyond that horizon. But I think once you've done it once, you've pushed yourself and you've found something surprising and you've come back and it's felt great. To finish up on my running analogy, once you've gone out, done that run in the rain, come back and felt euphoric, the next time you're facing the rain, you're almost looking forward to it.
I love that. And I couldn't agree more. It's the reason why we have the Adventure Sports Podcast. It's because we want to encourage people to try big things. And they don't have to be polar expeditions. What's big for each individual, let them define that. But to go and have experiences that enlarge our lives and build those memories. And one other thought I'd like to share with you is the other day I realized everybody makes a difference in this world. Some people make a difference for bad. Some people make a small difference. Some people make a huge difference. But you can't live in this space-time continuum without making an impact. And so the question I have for our listeners is, what kind of an impact are you making today? And what kind of things would you like to do to experience life in a whole new way? Thank you very much, Felicity, for coming on today and taking the time to share these amazing experiences with us. I think it's just wonderful what you're doing, and I applaud you. Good for you.
Thanks very much.
Oh, you bet. And for all the listeners out there, I always say get out there and have some fun. And after an interview like this one, that sounds almost trite, doesn't it? But maybe your fun is big, maybe your fun is little. Whatever it is, make sure you do get out there, make that difference in the world today, and have some fun.
Hey, thank you so much for listening today. Hope you enjoyed the show. Please do tell your friends about us. We want to make sure that we can help share the word, encouraging others and inspiring people to have great adventures and to make a difference in their world.